Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. The title of our video today is The Destruction of Jerusalem. Now, this happens to be lesson number 62 of our study of Jesus' life and ministry based on the Gospel of Mark. And the text today is the 13th chapter of Mark. The whole chapter, verses 1 through 37. Now, I'm not going to read all that. I'm only going to read the first 4 verses. But that'll set the stage and give us enough to understand what's being discussed in this chapter. And then we'll also make reference to the other Gospels who tell this same story. And the point is what Jesus was talking about and what he was not talking about. Okay, so let's take a look at this text. We'll be reading from the Simplified New Testament, which is my translation of the New Testament. And as I said, we'll read the first 4 verses. As Jesus and his followers were leaving the temple area, one of his disciples pointed out the temple to him. "Look how beautiful it is," he said to Jesus. "Just the stones themselves are magnificent." "Do you see all this?" Jesus said, looking at the temple and everything around it. "It will all be destroyed. There will not be a single stone left stacked on top of another. It will be completely flattened." Later, as Jesus rested at the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley from the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him what he meant about the temple being destroyed. They said, "Tell us when it will happen. Will there be signs so we will know that it is about to happen?" Now, whenever you're reading the Bible, it is extremely important for you to understand the context in which a statement is being made. Okay? Now, the context is simply the setting, what's going on at that time, what's being discussed, what the problem is, where they are, what everybody is doing. The context is just everything that is happening when this statement is made. Okay? If someone is writing a letter, like the Apostle Paul, he's writing a letter to the people in Ephesus, we'll say. Okay? Well, he's writing that letter to the Christians who live in the city of Ephesus in the first century. Okay? Now, when, let's say, Hosea wrote his book, the prophecy of Hosea, okay? He's one of the minor prophets. Now, he was writing that in ancient times, long before the Apostle Paul in the first century, and he was writing it to the people of Israel who lived under the Mosaic covenant. So the context, let's say, of Hosea and the context of Ephesians are completely different. Both of them are in the Bible, okay? They were both written by men of God, Hosea and Paul, a prophet and an apostle, okay? And they both contain a message from God. But Hosea's was to the ancient Israelites who were about to be punished because of what they were doing, right? And the letter to the Ephesians was written to Christians hundreds and hundreds of years later, and some of them were Israelites, Jews, but most of them were Hellenistic believers. Okay, they weren't Jews; they were Romans, right? And it's a completely different context. All right, and that's why when you read Hosea, it sounds and feels one way, and when you read Ephesians, it sounds and feels very different, because they were written by different people in different times, in different places, and the context is completely different. Okay? So you must always pay attention to the context. You can't go into a chapter and read a verse and just pluck that verse out of a chapter and say, well, this is what I think this verse means. You can't do that. That's just not allowed. That doesn't make good sense. Okay? It's not the way we live life. All right? It's not the way we communicate with people. All right? You have to look at what's said in the Bible in the context of a given discussion. Now, what is the context of this discussion in Mark 13? And it's exactly the same discussion that Matthew wrote about in Matthew 24 and that Luke wrote about in Luke 21. Okay? So you can go to all three sections. Matthew 24, read the whole thing. It's quite a bit longer than Mark 13, and then Luke 21. And they are all describing exactly the same event. It took place in that last week of Jesus' life in Jerusalem, a few days before he was betrayed and arrested and crucified. They were at the temple. They were getting ready to leave. They'd been there for hours. They were getting ready to leave and go back out of the city. And as they're going by or out of the temple area, one of the disciples mentions to Jesus, he said, Jesus, look, isn't this magnificent? Look at how beautiful this is. Just the stones themselves are magnificent. Isn't this great? And Jesus takes the opportunity. I mean, he could have just said, yeah, it's pretty. Come on, let's go. We're on a, he takes the opportunity to say, you see all this? There's coming a time when this will be completely destroyed. Now, you can imagine how confusing or startling that would be to his disciples. And then he just left. Okay, he didn't give them any explanation. And so they followed him, and they went out of the city and across the Kidron Valley, and they were in the Mount of Olives resting. And then some of his disciples go to him and say, what, earlier when you said, talked about all this will be destroyed, the temple and everything, what were you talking about? When is that going to happen? Okay, so beginning in verse 5, Jesus is answering that question. When is the temple and everything else, Jerusalem, when is it going to be destroyed? And so they specifically want to know what sorts of things will be happening just before the temple is destroyed. In other words, we're looking for some signs here so that when we see these things happening, we know, it's getting ready, it's getting close. Pretty soon, the Jerusalem will be destroyed. And so Jesus says, okay, that's a fair question. And so he begins to answer their question. Now, the problem with this text, and with Matthew 24 and with Luke 21, right, is that people read it without paying attention to those first 4 verses, without paying attention to the context. They just look up something in a concordance, or they just start reading, they get down to a verse that they like, and they take that verse and they pull it out and they say, this is talking about the end of time. No, it's not. It has nothing to do with the second coming of Jesus as it relates to the end of time. This isn't about the end of the world. It isn't. The question Jesus was asked is, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And that's the question that he's answering. Now, all you have to do is read those first 4 verses and keep them in mind as you read the rest of the chapter, and you understand Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, what's confusing about this is that Jesus uses language which we refer to as apocalyptic language. It is the language of judgment, the language of destruction, the language of punishment. And this is language that we find in the Old Testament, especially in Daniel, Ezekiel, and a couple of the other prophets, minor prophets, where God is threatening to come in judgment against Israel if they don't straighten up. And he sent prophet after prophet after prophet and said, if you don't straighten up, I'm coming down there and you're going to be sorry. I will come down there and I will punish you, and it will be like daytime turned to night. It will be like the moon turning to blood. There will be ashes. There will be on and on and on with all this horrible, scary language. Okay, and what is that? It is symbolic language. It is not to be understood literally. The moon will never, ever, ever, ever in history, ever turn to blood. That isn't ever going to happen. It's a symbolic reference to something horrible and frightening, and it means bad stuff's going to happen. Okay, that's what all of that language means. Bad stuff's going to happen because you have been sinful and you won't stop and you won't turn back to me. So bad stuff is going to happen. Look out, here I come, and you're not going to like it. Okay, see, that's what God was saying. It was apocalyptic language prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem. The Lord was going to come, but not the second coming, not the end of time. The Lord was coming in judgment. He was coming to punish them for their wickedness. Okay? Now, Jesus uses that exact same language to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, had Jerusalem been destroyed ever before? Yeah. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came, right? 586. Destroyed the whole thing. And then when Cyrus let the captives go, they came back to Jerusalem. They rebuilt it. And it was, again, a beautiful temple. But they have slipped back into sin. Not the sin of idolatry. They're not polytheistic anymore. But they're hypocritical. They're legalistic. They're hard. They're ugly people. They are not obeying the law of Moses. They have no relationship with God. They do not acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. They're going to murder him, right? And so when the disciples point out how beautiful the temple is, Jesus says, yeah, it's beautiful. But it's all going to be destroyed. It's all coming down, every bit. There won't even be one stone left upon another stone. All going to be flattened. And they say, when? And so he starts to tell them in this apocalyptic language when these things will happen. Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter and sit here and interpret symbol by symbol by symbol by symbol. I could do that. I've done it in other teaching contexts, but not going to do it now because it would make this video way too long. But the point is, he's not talking about the end of time. He's talking about Jesus, the Lord God, whichever you want to use, coming in judgment, against Jerusalem because the Israelites have slipped into sin. A different kind of sin than in the Old Testament, because then the sin was polytheism, worshiping other gods. Now it's different, but it's still sinful. And Jerusalem is going to be destroyed because they rejected the Messiah, because they murdered God's Messiah. Now, they haven't yet when Jesus is speaking this, but they will in just a few days, see? And so he uses this apocalyptic language. Now, it's always used in the context of God coming in judgment. And here, it's God coming in judgment against Jerusalem. It is not the end of the world. It just isn't. Now, some people, especially in Matthew 24, there's a much longer chapter, and there's a section break in there that people see. Okay, in the original Greek, there is no section break. Okay, there's no section break at all in the original Greek that Matthew wrote. All right, but people see a break in there and they go, okay, well, yeah, down to here, he's been talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but starting from here, verse 34 or something like that, now he's talking about this, the end of time. No, he's not. He absolutely is not. There is not one thing in that entire dialogue that suggests Jesus has stopped talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and takes up a new subject, the end of time, the end of the world. There's just nothing there. In the Greek, it's just one long dialogue from Jesus, monologue. Jesus is the one talking, okay? It's just one long speech from Jesus. There's no change of topics. Whether it's Matthew 24, Mark 13, or Luke 21, It is all talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, now, when will Jerusalem be destroyed? It already was. It happened in 70 A.D. when the Roman general Titus, who later became the emperor, but at that time, he was the general, surrounded Jerusalem, and he said, okay, I'll give you some time. If you want to get out of the city, get out, because we're coming. You got a couple of days to get out, and then we're coming. And the Christians, who knew what Jesus had said was going to happen, saw it. They said, okay, this is it. We got to get out of here. And so they all left. And some of the Jews left, but many of the hard, stubborn ones, they stayed. Titus brought in his Roman forces. They completely flattened it. 70 A.D. is when that happened. Jesus had been crucified probably in 30. So this is 40 years later. Okay, Jerusalem is destroyed. That's what this is talking about. It's not talking about the end of time. It's not talking about anything else. And even though the language may sound like it's talking about what you think is going to happen at the end of time, it isn't. Okay? You don't get to read a section in the Bible and think or say, well, I think it means this. It sounds like it means this to me. That's not the way it works. That's not the way biblical interpretation works. You have to look at the context. You have to understand the history. You have to understand the culture. You have to understand the language. You have to understand a lot of stuff in order to interpret the Bible correctly. And the correct interpretation of this is that Jesus is describing the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the question they asked, and that's the question he's answering. Okay? So, somebody tells you that this is talking about the end of the time, just understand that they haven't read it correctly. They're not thinking about those first four verses, and they're trying to have it mean whatever they want it to mean. And well, the Bible doesn't mean whatever you want it to mean. Okay? Let's just be honest here. Okay, the Bible doesn't mean just what somebody wants it to mean. It means what it means. Now, some people would say, see, that's double talk. It means what it means. What does that mean? Okay, I get it. I understand the difficulty with that. But what you have to understand is that this was written in a given context to a group of people, and it had meaning to those people. And in this case, it was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus is answering the question he was asked. Okay? They didn't ask him one question, and then he went off and answered a different question. See, that's rude. Nobody does that. Okay? No, nobody does that. Somebody says, what day of the week is it? And he said, I think tomorrow I'm going to have oatmeal for breakfast. What? I asked what day of the week it. Yeah, well, today for lunch we're going to have soup. I mean, see, that's rude. If somebody asks you a specific question, you answer that question. You don't just ignore their question and go off talking about something different. Who does that? Only rude people. And Jesus wasn't rude. Okay? He was asked a question. He's answering the question. The question was, when is Jerusalem going to be destroyed? This is the answer. And it happened back almost 2,000 years ago in 70 A.D. This is a historical text. It's got nothing to do with anything in the future. Absolutely nothing at all. Not one single thing. There is no future reference here for us because this happened back in 70 and it's now 2023. So 70 was a long time ago. It's all done. There isn't anything here about the future. Okay? Most of the New Testament is like that. Happened 2,000 years ago. It's not talking about stuff in the future. Now, there are some texts in the New Testament that talks about Jesus coming again, and that hasn't happened yet, has it? Okay, so we know there is a future event that's prophesied. Jesus is coming again, yeah, but we don't know when. And he gave no signs to tell anybody when that's going to happen. None whatsoever. And you don't need to know, I don't need to know. We just need to live our lives every day so that if Jesus does come today or tomorrow, we're ready. But when it might happen, we don't need to know that. Might be tomorrow, might be 10,000 years, might be 10 million years. Who knows? That's up to God. God lets this thing go on as long as he wants. Okay? It's up to him, not up to us. We don't need to know. We just need to be ready for whenever it happens. So, think about these things, and while you are, read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.